And welcome back. The medical malpractice attorneys at Duffy and Duffy are widely recognized for their premier advocates of victims of medical negligence. Now, recently, a jury awarded an $80 million medical malpractice verdict on behalf of a young man who suffered profound and permanent neurocognitive injuries as a result of the negligence of Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx. Joining us now to share more, we've got lead attorney at Duffy and Duffy law firm. We've got James LiCalzi, and James, thank you so much for being with us. And $80 million is a large settlement for medical malpractice. It says definitely negligence was in the balance. Talk to us about this case and what you found to be the most important.
Sure. First of all, Daren, the verdict was for $80 million. There was a settlement for a lower amount while the jury was deliberating. The most interesting thing about this case, and I think the jury sent the message that it was a wake-up call to the City of New York, the Health and Hospitals Corporation, that the care for these Bronx families has to improve. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from this matter. You know, Hakeem is a profoundly injured young man. He's unable to speak. He's nonverbal. He didn't learn how to walk until he was 9 years old. He had a feeding tube in for 7 years. He had a tracheostomy, a breathing tube in his neck for 5 years. His mother, Teresa, is a remarkable woman who has dedicated her entire life to caring for this young man. And what I'm most proud about is the money recovered is going to allow him to be properly cared for the remainder of his life. So Teresa, you know, Daren, we're all not going to live forever. So Teresa is, you know, has the comfort knowing if she's no longer around to care for Hakeem, that the money is there to properly care for him, you know, when she's no longer with us.
Please acquaint our viewers with the circumstances with regards to the case. Of course, as we said, this now affecting Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx. But for somebody who's not so familiar with the case, let's take them through it real quickly.
Sure. So Teresa was 31 years old at the time that she became pregnant with Hakeem. It's actually her sixth pregnancy. She had all prior preterm or premature deliveries. That's when a baby's delivered before full term, right, which is anywhere between 38 and 40 weeks. And unfortunately, she, you know, in the past, she actually had one child who was a miscarriage. But Hakeem, when Teresa became pregnant with Hakeem, her history was well known to her doctors, that she had prior premature births. And in fact, in the pregnancy just prior to Hakeem's, she was diagnosed with a condition called an incompetent cervix or cervical insufficiency, where the cervix, which is the part of the lower uterine segment, it connects the vagina to the uterus. It just was not sufficiently strong to maintain the pregnancy. So they put a stitch in this prior pregnancy called a cerclage in an effort to provide strength to keep the cervix closed, to try to get the baby as far as long in the pregnancy as possible. Unfortunately, with Hakeem's pregnancy, when she was referred to the high-risk clinic at Jacobi Medical Center, she was referred with this diagnosis of incompetent cervix. It was known that she had an incompetent cervix. It was known she had a cerclage in this prior pregnancy, but unfortunately, the doctors who cared for her at Jacobi at the high-risk maternal fetal medicine clinic, whether didn't recognize it in a timely manner, ignored it, or really at the trial, they took the position they thought, based on her history, she really didn't have this condition. However, they never made any efforts to get the records from St. Barnabas Hospital, where she had this prior pregnancy, where they diagnosed this condition, where they treated it with this cerclage. And the ideal treatment for this condition is something called a prophylactic or history-indicated cerclage, to do it between 13 and 16 weeks gestation. They missed that window. And on top of that, to make matters worse, they didn't monitor her cervix. There's a medical test, a diagnostic imaging test called a transvaginal sonogram, where they can monitor the condition of the cervix to try to get ahead of the curve. If they see it shortening or opening up, they can intervene in a timely manner, and they didn't do that here either. They missed the window for both these really vital, important things to keep this baby safe while he was in utero. And all this led to the baby being born, Hakeem being born at 23 weeks gestation, which is really on the edge of what's called viability. 70% of these children who are born at 23 weeks don't survive. 30% of them who do survive, the vast majority of them have profound neurocognitive and intellectual disabilities like Hakeem. So literally all the medical testimony, 9 doctors testified during the course of this trial. Everyone acknowledges every day in utero at 23, 24 weeks makes a huge difference. And unfortunately, this mother and this baby were deprived of the ability to stay in utero for as long as possible to avoid these devastating consequences of a preterm or premature birth, what's called extreme prematurity at 23 weeks. And it's really very sad.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the fact that you were able to successfully go against Jacobi Medical Center and receive this settlement. We understand the jury came through with the verdict. Later on, a settlement amount was reached. But to prove medical malpractice, to prove medical negligence, a lot of people feel as though it's an uphill battle. Give us some insight as to what is necessary to prove medical negligence if somebody's out there saying, listen, I think I may have been wrong, I need some help.
Listen, it is always an uphill battle. It's a challenge in every case, in every one of my clients, to establish and prove medical negligence. Just because it's so hard to get a jury to understand or believe that a physician, committed negligence in their care. What's needed is, first of all, an attorney who's going to know every bit of the record, the medical records backwards and forwards, and then on top of that, have the ability and the resources to consult with and retain appropriate medical experts who, during the course of the trial, are called to testify and explain to the jury what exactly was done wrong here. So, by a good attorney who's able to understand the medicine, know what's in the records, explain it to a jury, and then produce a medical expert who's able to communicate to the jury what departures, the technical term is departures or deviations from the accepted standards of care, what those departures or deviations were. That is really the biggest challenge in these cases, to really, get the jury to understand what proper medical care is or was, and how the healthcare providers failed in these particular circumstances. So that's really the greatest challenge.
Yeah. And so when can a person actually take the time to file a lawsuit? When is the moment that you know that I can go forward with a lawsuit?
Sure. So in New York, if you're an adult, you have 2.5 years from the time of the negligence to file a lawsuit. If you are an infant, you have 10 years from the date of your birth. Or if it's a birth injury case, or 2.5 years from the time you turn 18, as long as it's within that 10-year period, depending on when the negligence occurred. So those are the time frames. But really, people are smart. People have common sense. They understand. And listen, medicine's, there's not always guarantees that things are going to go well. All right. It's unfortunate. There's no guarantees, and medicine is really more of an art than a science. But if your doctor's not communicating things properly, sometimes you get a roll of the eyes from a nurse or from one of the doctors, people can tell when something is wrong, when something went wrong. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask physicians to explain themselves, to nurses to explain themselves, why something happened. Could this have been found sooner? You may not get a direct answer, but I think most people really, when they have a gut feeling that something went wrong with either themselves or their loved ones or their pregnancy, and obviously someone, whether they get seriously hurt, whether they're damaged, whether, God forbid, they pass away, that's when they should consult with an attorney. But really, timeliness is important. When memory is fresh. So I'm not saying while you're in the hospital, get on the phone with your attorney. But if you get out of the hospital or something happens to a loved one, if you really feel something went wrong, reach out to an attorney, reach out to Duffy and Duffy, and we'll give you at least some insight as to, do we think something happened here that's improper? And then we have to follow up with getting the medical records and reviewing them and consulting with appropriate experts.
How big, or how high, should I say, is that threshold when you're trying to prove medical negligence? Because I think the reason that some people don't hesitate to, or do hesitate to do it, is because there is such a high threshold.
Well, listen, it's certainly the legal threshold is not like a criminal case. Criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. But in a civil case, you have to convince a jury. There's 6 jurors in civil cases, and only 5 of the 6 of them have to agree on any particular question. You have to establish that it's more probable than not that this deviation or departure from accepted medical standards occur, and that deviation or departure caused damages and injury to the individual. So it is challenging. It does take individuals or firms who have resources. These cases are fiercely litigated. There's very good attorneys who always represent healthcare providers, who represent hospital systems and hospitals. So it is challenging, but just because it's challenging doesn't mean you don't, investigate it. And if it's warranted, go through with it.
All righty. Well, James LiCalzi gave us some great information there. Again, thank you for your work, and we'll continue to follow this story and then much more. Thanks for being with us.
Daren, thank you so much. Take care.
All righty. Well, we want our viewers to know, for more information, you can visit the website at duffylaw.com, and then follow them on Twitter at Duffy Law.